Welcome to Airship Archaeology, featuring Taylor, Isaac, and Sam. I am the announcer guy, and I'm excited to be here. On to the show.
So what kind of music have you been listening to recently, Isaac?
I recently have been getting into the more of what I kind of scratched the surface of previously, which is the like garage punky blues kind of stuff, like early Black Keys and White Stripes and stuff, but getting into some of the more unknown bands. No, but that's been fun. My favorite one that I've found is actually like one of the grandfathers of that kind of movement, which are a local-ish band from Tacoma called the Sonics.
Oh.
If you've heard of them.
Isn't that a basketball team?
Rest in peace. Yeah, no, but the Sonics were around in like the 60s, and they were one of the first groups to take like rock stuff in that kind of direction, which is fun.
Yeah.
Like my favorite song of theirs in particular is their version of "Have Love Will Travel." It's very, very good stuff.
I've never heard of that song or that band.
Half Love, HALF or HAVE?
Have HAVE.
Ah, okay. Have Love
Will Travel.
Will Travel. Ah, yes.
Is that like a name of someone, or is that saying, "Do you have love, you will travel"?
That's up to you to interpret, I think. They're not like the Pope.
Very
They're not going to
art.
tell you what to think. This is punk rock, man.
So punk. Wow.
What about you, Tay?
People entering my house. I've been listening to... So I watched... I don't know if this was before last Thursday or after, but I watched Bridge of Spies with the house. And they mentioned Dmitry Shoshkovich, something like that. I can't remember now. Long Soviet name, kind of Cold War era, obviously, because of the movie. But he has this sound that he's trying to incorporate a lot of different cultures from the 50s and 60s into his music. It's classical music. Kind of, I guess. It's part of that. But it's been interesting because I've never really listened to much modern classical music. And especially from the second half of the 20th century. It's been interesting because I really like classical music, and especially like the 19th century French classical tradition, which is more impressionism and romantic. But listening to this has been fascinating because you can kind of hear the influence, but then also you can kind of hear the state of the world during the Cold War in it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I've been
Sam?
Okay. I've been listening to two different types of music. So it's like if I'm doing schoolwork, I listen to more kind of like, I don't know, electronic-y or ambient type music. And usually if it's songs with words, it has to be songs that I haven't really heard of before. And I actually just heard of this band for the first time, and so I've been listening to them the past week. They're called China, spelled Chinah.
Tricky.
Yeah, and I know, right? I think they're trying to get you there. And so I like to listen to them this past week or so when I've been doing some schoolwork, but other than that, it's mostly been like the soundtrack to the musical Hamilton. I've been kind of just
there you go.
chilling on that for the last since it's come out. So yeah.
I haven't listened to it yet, the Hamilton.
I would recommend it very, very highly. I mean, your first listen through, you got to listen to it like start to end. But after that, not music, but something I have been listening to. A new podcast that I just heard about on a recent This American Life. So I heard about it on a different podcast. But I think it's called, what's it, Beautiful... So, okay, I got to remember this. I want to get it right. Beautiful Stories with Anonymous People. So the idea is that this guy, I forget his name, he just whenever he does the podcast, he just opens his lines, and the first call he come through or whatever it is, he just talks to that person for 60 minutes. And, like, he has to stay on for the whole 60 minutes. If the other person leaves, like, that's fine. But, like, he has to, no matter what, stay on the line.
Huh.
In the first episode, he's talking to this guy, and he, like, finds out that the guy was delivered by Ron Paul, and that he was conceived, like, at a carnival in a bathroom, and that he was rethinking his life. And so...
God, yeah. That turned very different than what I was expecting.
Yeah.
Real fast. Wow.
So I've only listened to that first episode, but it's really good. So at least that first episode, worth a listen.
Yeah.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah.
I don't quite get it, but maybe I should listen to it.
Yeah.
I think you lost me at Ron Paul, and then everything went out the door immediately.
Well, it's kind of the podcast equivalent of just like going to a bar and just talking to somebody randomly who's there, right? It's like just talk to people, whatever.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect analogy for it.
Yeah, so when are we going to start, having call-ins?
I think we need to have an audience of bigger than just us and my wife, and then we might be able to do that. Actually. Hey, Sarah. Do you want to call my
before,
phone?
I think.
1 second, guys. I have a feeling we might have our first caller soon.
Oh my gosh, that's how famous we are.
Mm-hmm.
A first caller. Just let's not mention the last name. That might give it away. Give it away the nothing.
Hey, there's lots of Smiths,
ambiguous.
Man.
Yeah,
a lot of iron needs to be hit.
Right.
What, guys? I'm getting a call. This is so unexpected. This has never happened before. Okay. Hello, this is Sam Smith. I'm the host of Airship Archaeology. You're on the air. What's your name?
Sarah Smith.
Sarah Smith. Wow, what a coincidence.
Sarah
We have the
Smith.
same last name.
Well, I mean, it is one of the most common last names, so.
I know, that's what I was just talking about with my co-host. Do you guys have any questions for this caller, who I assume is a first-time caller but a long-time listener? Also, you can't hear them, I guess, so that's not gonna...
Oh, yeah. That's...
Do you have any questions for us?
Let's see. Nope.
Nope. Okay. Well, thank you for calling. It was wonderful.
Better
to talk
luck
to you.
next time?
Yeah, better luck next time, says Taylor. So.
Oh, thanks.
Okay. Bye. Love you.
Bye. Love you too.
So, I
That
mean,
was
I
great.
think
Can we get another caller?
Yeah, it was a pretty successful first caller, though. I mean, we didn't get cursed out. Only seemed positive. I don't know. Yeah.
It was perfect.
Yeah.
No negative criticisms of us.
So I think we can.
Are there any?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I want to talk about Isaac's little things, because I'm just now reading them for the first time today.
Okay.
Oh boy.
Isaac's conversation topics.
Mm-hmm. Go
Whoa,
ahead.
Sam, I can see your cursor. That's really weird. Sorry, off topic.
No, that's a different podcast.
Anyway.
That's a Rooster Teeth podcast. I got that.
Nice.
Whoa.
Go ahead, Ted.
Hey, let's talk about other podcasts for half an hour. Speaking of other podcasts, there's a YouTuber named CGP Grey who makes educational videos that are very good, and he, in one of these videos, to bridge into this topic very smoothly and very awesome segue,
I mean, it was until that.
which was also the joke. This is the problem, is that I derail myself with. Anyway, so he made a video talking about, looking at the history of North America, of the New World in general. You learn in school that a big reason why the Europeans were successful in colonizing is because they brought diseases with them from Europe, and the native population died out in enormous amounts, and that was really crucial to them succeeding. And so he goes around and he asks the question, well, why wasn't there he calls it an America pox, is the title of his video. Why wasn't there a disease in the New World that spread to the Europeans and infected them and all this stuff? And so he does a bunch of research, and he kind of backs into a conclusion that's very similar to one posited in Jared Diamond's famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that book, which is rather controversial among historians and other types of people, for some of the
readers of books and non-readers of books.
Both historians and non-historians, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah.
It's controversial because there's debate about some of the minor details of things that it talks about, but the basic theory it presents is that different continents are better or worse to start out from if your intent as a civilization is to like develop technology to colonize the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, like, it was not that it was necessarily predestined, but that it was most likely that a civilization from Eurasia would come to dominate the rest of the world at some point, is like the basic premise of it. And it gets down to things like one of the big drivers is the types of animals that are able to be domesticated.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the New World, there's basically llamas, and that's it. And llamas are not.
Next,
like,
we
great
didn't have
farm
horses.
animals.
Were alpacas not?
I mean, alpacas too. That's basically.
Okay.
I mean, same deal as llamas, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
But in the old world, you had horses, you had cows, you had goats, sheep, all these kind of things.
Pigs.
And so, anyway, so he traces the
Rats.
same argument. Nice. That Jared Diamond does, and says basically, well, having all these wonderful animals available makes big agricultural cities easier, makes big industrial cities easier, and having all these industrial cities that are filthy and full of animals make for diseases. But anyway, so like what I wanted to ask was, what's your guys' take on this sort of, this very systemic kind of view of history that doesn't allow for, not that it doesn't allow for, but it doesn't think that individuals have an outsized kind of impact on history. It wasn't that Christopher Columbus was some mega hero or
Mhm.
genius,
Yeah.
clearly, but rather that, it was just kind of, it was most likely that somebody from Eurasia would end up doing what he did.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is for each of you is just like, do you buy into the like systemic view of history? Do you think that individuals have more impact than that kind of view allows for? Or do you have some other, what other views do you have?
Kind of not an answer to the question, but when I think about disease coming across the Atlantic to the west, it's that in itself wasn't like a purposeful thing.
Yeah.
When there's a disease sitting on your blankets or in your shoes or in your sneeze, it's like they didn't know that because they didn't know better. When you have it, when you live through a disease, you're immune.
Exactly.
And you don't think about it again. So like, sure, that happened and it seems very human, but you have to like ask the question whether an accidental, outbreak is their fault per se, because some people can argue it was. Why was it right for the people in Europe to go over to America in the first place? But also, like, if they had an idea that, oh, maybe we're going to kill them with these diseases, is this a good idea? But I don't know. It's tough, I guess, from a historical standpoint.
I think it's really interesting to me because I would say that I probably generally agree with it, that civilizations and the people within them kind of are, it's like, it's more they grow out of the circumstances that they exist in. And I think that has a huge impact because, I mean, even thinking on a much smaller scale, when you look at the circumstances and how they play into people's lives, it's like when you look at people, say in the United States, that grow up in a lower socioeconomic status, like their expected like earnings, their expected education level, like health level, all those things, it's stunted. And that's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with those people, because I don't believe that. And that's not to say that there's not someone in that circumstance who can build their way up to be the best person that's ever been in the world. But like you were saying, Isaac, that it's more of it's like a probability that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I guess with that basic premise, I fall on the side of really agreeing with that it's not like a foregone conclusion, but the fact that it is pretty likely.
Yeah. And that was the point that he made in his video as well. It's like, it's not impossible that Australia could have risen up and conquered the world. But if you're, as he puts it, like if you're playing a board game or a video game and you're picking a continent to start on, it's like Eurasia gets maybe like a 75% chance, and Africa gets a 10% chance, and you go down and maybe Australia has like a 2% chance or something. There's just all the animals are terrifying. There's very few natural resources, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think the probabilistic part of it is definitely key, because it people are queasy to say things like well, Europe was just destined to dominate because it's historically tied into ideas like, oh, the white man is just smarter and better, and that's why he's dominating all these ethnics and all this kind of stuff. And so people are, for a good reason, like they're wary to try to make statements like that. But I don't think that's not the argument that he's making.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because now this next segment is going to be me talking with general historical knowledge, but with no details whatsoever. So feel free to call me out if you know something else. But like with China in particular, granted, you said Eurasia and they're a part of Asia, so it makes sense. Yeah. But like China, they had been sending out a lot of like exploration expeditions, I guess, and they'd even like, there's a lot of evidence to show that they rounded the tip of Africa and were going up the west coast of Africa, but then they just decided to stop. And so, I mean, that, like, how different would Eurasia have played out if the first people to make contact with the Chinese and they were kind of coming in from that position of power?
Yeah.
And so it's just like, and that's kind of to back up with the fact that it's not that the Europeans were inherently the best, but kind of that they just were the luckiest,
Yeah, if you look at, like, in that time period, in the like mid to late 1400s, Europe was not the gleaming example of human civilization, right? They were, in a lot of ways, technologically well behind, especially the Middle East and China. And it's like but yeah, I don't know. I definitely agree. I don't know that much about the circumstances. I don't know how much anybody knows about the circumstances of that, like those Chinese expeditions that you mentioned. But certainly, like, whatever caused them to turn back, it's like that's could have happened very differently.
It's interesting to think about, though, because I mean, I was reading a book not too long ago. It was about Genghis Khan and how he had his little expeditions into Europe, his military expeditions into Europe, and he was stopped, but he got really close to being able to take over all of Europe if he wanted to. And it's just because at that time Europe really was just this backwater place that didn't have too much going for it. And,
yeah.
I mean, there's arguments to say that Europe, they weren't great, as in they weren't great people, but it really does feel like to me that they somewhat stumbled into the greatness, assuming that the goal of, like you said, was to dominate the world in that way.
Yeah. You look at things even like how the trade winds blow across the Atlantic makes it very easy for you to go from Iberia to like Brazil in the Caribbean, where it's much, much tougher even to go from China over to the west coast of the U.S. just based on how the wind and the atmosphere works and stuff like that. And there's all sorts of little kind of built-in advantages that way. Are there any other takes on that before I move on to my little tangent here?
I just think the question "what if" is really similar when in the context of history and like looking into the future. If you think about it, like you can always ask what if what I do now affects this in the future, but you can always turn it around and say what happened in 15 something or another, what would it be like today? It's just an interesting thought experiment, I guess.
It kind of the way that sci-fi does that sometimes, where they'll set up historical events but in like the sci-fi context and kind of explore them that way.
Yeah, exactly. It's fun. That's why history's fun and not boring.
Yes, it is. It's boring when it's taught poorly,
Tangent.
which is why I think lots of people hate it. All right.
Tangent.
So, history tangent. So my question is this. do you root for the Romans? And when I say that, what I mean is, when you're learning
Oh.
about Roman history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you hear, oh man, the Romans are running around Germany. Oh, there's this Roman column rolling down in a forest in Germany, and they get jumped by a bunch of German dudes and destroyed. It's like, when you read that, do you go, oh man, those poor Romans? Or do you go, like, oh yeah, go get 'em, Germans, freaking take back your country kind of thing? Like, history is usually told from, if you're reading about a book about Napoleon, it's going to be written from the French perspective, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Or stuff written about Rome is mostly going to be written
At least
from the Roman
primary
perspective.
sources.
Yeah,
Primary
exactly.
sources will be, yeah.
So like, do you guys find yourselves rooting for forces like Rome, or like how do you, what's your emotional tie-in to stuff like that?
I'm obligated to root for Rome based on my major, but because I wouldn't have my major if Rome didn't win anything. But I like to ask the question: what if? Again, another what if? Like, what if Rome stopped here, or what if they didn't take over Greece? Well, that's the Greeks' problem. They kind of just didn't have much control over themselves, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But the overarching question is, if there was no rum, oh my gosh,
If there were no
We'd
rum,
all be very sad.
there's no rum, there would be no Pirates of the Caribbean.
that's good,
That
Jack
would be
Sparrow.
Okay. If there was no Rome, Western culture would not be what it is at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it would be different because there's someone inclined or predisposed, quote unquote, to be that civilization.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good and tough question.
Because it's like, if there were no Rome, there likely would just be another civilization that would have played a similar role, is kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you guys are taking this in a beautiful direction. I meant it in a, like a, if they're fighting the Parthians, do you like, yeah, go get them, Parthians, or like on a very basic, like, not like would I want Rome to have existed, but I like this direction. Let's keep going that way.
Okay. Well, real quick, I'll just answer your question. I really like all the Roman ruins. I just think they're kind of cool. And so I'm going to go with sure. I'll root for the Romans. I think things turned out all right, at least for me, if I'm being selfish, with how everything happened. So yeah, I'll root for the Romans. They got some cool armor. I like their look, their aesthetic.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think, oh man, again, this is taking it in a different direction than you're wanting, Isaac. But
That's great.
No, go for
I
it.
think the Romans did impact education for the long run. I don't think we're going to go away. I mean, we're more of a curriculum-based education now, but we're kind of rooted in classical education. We still read about Rome. It's important for America. It's important for Europe as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But there are ideas on education where, in my opinion, just brilliant. Like, you can't really argue against it very strongly, even today.
Yeah.
But in terms of the Roman Empire, it's kind of hard to root for. Just, conquer the world in self-defense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting. It's just interesting to think about. 'Cause, like, how, I mean, granted, they made a lot of contributions to what we think of as the world today, but it's not like there would have been no one filling that vacuum.
Mm-mm.
Do
Exactly.
you know enough about history back then to like who was kind of the second in power, who would be
Second
taking
place.
that role?
Assume I'm losing you. You there?
I
Yeah.
mean, I'll send that to you,
Okay,
Taylor.
that's great.
Mm-hmm.
So second place to Rome.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, there's the issue with that question is, like I said, Rome conquered so much they weren't very polite to the history that was written then.
Ooh.
They just didn't care,
Mhm.
right? There's a few instances where there's Roman translations of things, but even that, the Latin translations of even Greek culture was just slim. They just rewrote them the way they wanted it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think because Greece was spread kind of thin, they kind of lost it. If Macedonia and the Peloponnesian War, all that stuff didn't affect Greece so much in terms of power. I guess Alexander was a lot a ways after that, but he just kind of spread out. If you watch one of those cool, well, I think they're cool, like maps of the Mediterranean world, and you kind of go like year by year, you can see like Greeks, and then all of a sudden Romans explode, right?
Yeah.
You wonder why, and I mean the kind of simple answer is they spread themselves a bit thin and lost a lot of power after Alexander died because they just couldn't control anything, right?
And there's a lot of
I
infighting
don't know.
too, wasn't it, between his successors?
Yeah, exactly. The three, the Ptolemies,
Yeah.
the Macedonians, which don't even count because they ended up being Ptolemies, and then the Syrian and the Levant. So it's kind of easy to take over that when you have the Roman army. Empire. Is it empire at that point? Let's see, 27 BC. So a little bit after Alexander's death, you have the Roman Empire taking over, and then the explosion of their culture.
But the Greek culture too was pretty, like you say, they stretched themselves kind of thin, but they also, like, they had little outposts and stuff like all over the Mediterranean too. Like they had a big colony in Sicily. They were all the way out to the eastern coast of Spain. Like,
Yep.
They were the big roots of there, as I understand.
Yeah.
Even like, how much did someone
And
like
maybe
some civilization like the Roman Empire?
Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say, one of the bigger differences between Rome and Greece was Greece tended, when they conquered, they tended to not really incorporate anyone's values. And I could be kind of saying that strongly, but Rome did a pretty good job of allowing whoever they conquered to still kind of practice their own worship. The great example is obvious, Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Rome conquers Jerusalem. There's still people able to worship Yahweh. There's still people following the prophets of Israel, and Greece really wouldn't have much of that per se.
And I guess, okay, so what I was saying before I cut out was that, like, with the Roman Empire, and I guess with, Greece, but I think more so with the Roman Empire, how much smaller they made the world, and I feel like the effect that had on the world. Like you were saying with education, but there's like all roads lead to Rome, the idea that it's just like they made the world smaller, I feel like, in a way that had never happened beforehand.
Oh.
And I mean, just and then also with that greater tolerance of ideas and of other religions, like I feel like that was a net positive,
Sure.
but speaking out of a place of some ignorance. So
I think the tolerance thing is also just kind of a pragmatic, how do I rule this enormous swath of territory, right? It's like kind of live and let live to some extent.
yeah. So this is
kinda...
No, you go. No.
Okay. Well, I was gonna change directions a bit.
Do it, yeah.
I guess one of the questions one could have in like comparative history is, how do you compare Rome and its conquering of the world, quote unquote, in self-defense, to America's holding back of conquering the world, even though most people think we probably could, or at least could have. Kind of leads into the Obama Doctrine, right?
Okay, so
why send missiles to show you can send missiles?
real quick, could you? So you said this a couple times, where like Rome conquering the world in self-defense. So that last little bit, what exactly do you mean by that?
It's kind of just a classic little funny thing where you say Rome conquered the world in self-defense because they just couldn't stop conquering. Because they're like, well, what about these guys? They can have an uprising. Let's conquer them real quick.
Okay.
That's how they just spread.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not going to say Rome was afraid. They're the most powerful empire in the world back then. But that's kind of why. They weren't afraid to say, maybe we shouldn't knock out this tribe because they're not really harming us. But they always ask, they probably could harm us a little bit. So let's harm them a lot.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, again, then going back to your question that you asked. So you mentioned the Obama Doctrine last podcast. And I read up on it. I read the vast majority of it. I think there's like 2 paragraphs at the end I didn't finish. But I think it's really interesting because, like you were saying, in kind of America holding themselves back, and I think that's true for pretty much all of American history. But obviously, the article focused on Obama, and Obama's administration really seeming to prioritize what is something that is relevant to America. It like is a direct threat in terms of responding to that, which is just interesting because, I mean, it just makes sense. It's like we could deal with a lot, but why do we care about what's going on in certain parts of the world if it's not like with Russia and Ukraine? It was kind of like, well, Ukraine isn't of direct interest to the United States, so why do we want to like interfere there and maybe assert power there? And
there's probably a lot the general public doesn't know about even basic relationships in countries. Like, we know the big ones. We have a relationship with China for trade. We have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, Canada, because we're neighbors and they have yummy maple syrup. And Canada Dry.
Taylor just showed a can of Canada Dry to the call.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was like,
and
what was I saying? Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah, there's a lot that the general public doesn't really understand about relationships, and I guess a big governmental thing that is probably even over the heads of the government to some extent, because there's always, there's never 100% yes or 100% no in government. Like, how do we interfere or intervene without breaking a even small relationship over here or there, And what I got out of the Obama Doctrine is he's essentially saying, unless it's a threat to American land, then he's going to have second thoughts, maybe third thoughts about certain intervention.
And it was of particular interest to me when it seemed to... dang it, I lost my thought. When he was talking about, like, so he understands that America needs to be in the forefront, like, whenever there's, like, G8 or G20 meetings of, like, forming this agenda for the world, and kind of seeing how that's necessary, but not necessarily thinking that, I mean, as of right now, it's like, the best thing, but then he's so confident in the power the United States has, but then also is hesitant to use it in a way that I feel like is new to my understanding, He's like, we are in a position where we are really shaping this. Like, we are needed. I mean, the fact that it was mentioned that, like, Britain only spends 2% of its GDP on defense, it's like, it's because we provide defense for everyone. But he's still so, like, reticent, and I don't know, like you said, it was a lot of respect in that, and understanding the power, but then kind of in the cliche, like, with great power does come great responsibility,
Love it. Love that cliche.
You see, with great power comes... Oh, go ahead, Taylor.
No, you go ahead. I've been interrupting all night.
I was going to say, with great power comes great responsibility, and also in international relations, you say, we don't always know what we're doing either, or we don't always have all the facts.
Yeah.
It's also impossible to predict 20 years into the future. In the article, one of the things was talked about, maybe it was Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, had recommended arming the rebels in Syria, like right off the bat. And that just brings to mind for me that the U.S. back in the Cold War days armed rebels in Afghanistan, which turned into the Taliban, which, then we ended up fighting with later. And it's like, I don't know, it's difficult to see when you're saying, well, this struggle with Russia we see as a struggle for our very nation and the safety of the world and everything, so we have to do anything we can to achieve this goal, but then it's difficult to see the kind of impact that arming an Islamist group can have.
Like taking that step back and really, like, willing to think about the decision instead of just reacting to something that seems like a really urgent need, when really thinking maybe it's not as urgent as necessary as many people think.
Exactly.
And also we have to think about how Obama's coming after Bush, who kind of obviously spread himself thin over in the Middle East. And I know Obama respects George Bush Sr., especially the Gulf War and Persian stuff, but even being the president who's trying to clean up a bit is tough because, I mean, 2 wars have kind of already started since Obama was inaugurated in '08, and it's like, how far can one go with like the overarching goal of helping the world become peaceful or stopping wars? It's always a tough question.
Yeah. And the article, at least the way the author made it seem, I forget what, Jeffrey Goldberg, he was saying that, like, really the Middle East isn't Obama's main interest. Like, it's not his main focus, which is really weird because I feel like it's still so much of what we hear about that you would think, at least in, like, America's consciousness, and you would think in the government's thinking, it is the main focus.
Yeah.
But at least the author expressed it in such a way that really it's taken a pretty far back burner, you know?
Yeah, it just sounds better on the news. That's what people want to read about.
Yeah. So this was the geopolitical history podcast.
Hey, if you want to tie around all those topics that we talked about, too, one of the things that struck me about the article was talking about, because it mentions Obama had drawn the red line, so-called, in Syria, saying you can't pass this use of chemical weapons on your own citizens. And when evidence was presented that had happened, he didn't actually, declare war on Syria. He didn't sort of back it up, quote unquote. And the article, presented it, I think, correctly as like Obama's understanding of what the executive position of president of the U.S. should be, and what the limits of that very broad power, as he put it, a broad but limited power, should be. And I think that's a very heroic thing to say. I have this potentially theoretically unlimited power. The president can basically sort of declare war, wherever he wants, essentially. But he said, well, I don't have international support for this. I don't have congressional support for this. I can't, it's not an immediate pressing threat to the U.S. I can't justify this. Which reminded me of the very famous story of Cincinnatus in Rome, who was, they made him, they gave him temporary, I forget the name of the position, but they gave him temporary power in emergency to fight off some enemy they were facing. And he could have come back and stayed as the absolute ruler, but he chose not to, and he went back to his farm. And and people compare him to George Washington for that reason, because George Washington could have gone on to be president forever, and so but he elected not to. He elected to stop after 2 terms. But I think that laying down of absolute power when you're in a position where nobody can stop you is a very cool thing.
And to tie it back into more topics, there's actually a song in the musical Hamilton that is when George Washington's talking to Alexander Hamilton about how he wants him to help draft his farewell address. Which, you guys really listen to the podcast. At least listen to that song, the podcast, the musical.
Nice.
But yeah, just like the George Washingtons, I guess the Cincinnatuses, and the Obamas, at least in that instance of history, like those are positions that are really unenviable, which is why you give them, at least to me, like there's so much respect in being willing to step away from that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks for hanging with us today at Airship Archaeology. Join us again next time for more scintillating discussion. I, for one, cannot wait. I have been the announcer guy, and I'm signing off. Cheerio.